The Tyrrell Crescent shootings happened in Melbourne on Monday morning, December the 5th, 1994. On that morning, 49-year-old Fotius Diakonidis, also known as Frank I believe, shot dead 2 people and, as far as I can tell, slightly wounded 1 other person. Now, the Tyrrell Crescent shootings have virtually been forgotten by everyone. At the time, it received a fair bit of publicity and was described appropriately as a kind of mini Hoddle Street massacre. But despite the gunman Fotius Diakonidis walking out into the street and randomly shooting at anyone he saw, amazingly, the death toll remained at 2. And as I've said, at the time, there were reports that 3 people had been wounded, but I've only ever been able to find 1 case of another person wounded, and that was a superficial wound from glass hitting their windshield and penetrating the shoulder. But nonetheless, I remember it well. It was a stinking hot day here in Adelaide, and it was similar weather in Melbourne in the high 30s, and I just remember it happening, and for some reason it has stayed with me, while it quickly faded from the news. But nonetheless, I decided I would visit Tyrrell Crescent in Fawkner, which is in the northern suburbs of Melbourne, and film the locations of where this multiple shooting happened, where, of course, despite it being relatively forgotten now, 2 people were murdered, and a 3rd man, the gunman Diakonidis, was shot dead by police. A bit of background on Fotius Diakonidis, and it's not easy to find. Fortunately, I preserved some newspapers at the time. Particularly, here's the Herald Sun from December 6, 1994, which has given me a lot of information. Well, some information anyway. So I've just jotted down some notes about Diakonidis. Now, of course, there's always a reason, or the question always is why someone does what they do. And I never believe there's one motive. I think it's an accumulation of frustration and anger that builds over many years, where eventually the person either snaps or decides to snap. I think in this case, Diakonidis did not plan specifically that morning to go out and shoot people. I think he'd obviously thought about it, and I guess on this particular morning something made him make the decision. But what I've been able to gather is that in the late 1970s, Diakonidis and his brother Christos, I think was his name, opened a nightclub in Smith Street, Fitzroy, which they ran into the early 1980s. I think it was described as like a Greek cabaret club. But in 1981 1982, Diakonidis was involved in a couple of car accidents by the looks of it, and around the same time, circa 1982, he dissolved his partnership in the business with his brother. And then at some point later in the 1980s, he tried to reclaim his share of the business, which evolved into a long legal battle. I guess his brother, I'm not sure of the exact circumstances, but perhaps his brother didn't want to, or didn't feel that he deserved his share. But nonetheless, Diakonidis, in his efforts to reclaim his share from his brother from the business, approached 7 different law firms, who all told him that he had no case to answer for, and which didn't go down well with old Diakonidis, and he ended up suing both his brother and 33 different lawyers from the 7 law firms to get his money back. Bear with me as I look at my notes here. So in December 1991, Diakonidis actually won his lawsuit against his brother because his brother failed to appear in court. But from what I'm reading, I don't think he got any money because his brother, the business had long since closed, and I think his brother was unable to be located. So even though he won the case against his brother, he didn't get any money. But in May 1994, what's this, just 7 months before the shootings, he lost the case against the 33 lawyers, which put him in considerable debt. And in July 1994, Diakonidis declared bankruptcy, something like $156,000 in debt. So they were the circumstances that led up to the events of the morning of December 5th, 1994, at his home, number 38 Tyrrell Crescent, I do believe, where Diakonidis lived in Fawkner. Now, at about approximately 7:15 a.m. that morning, something occurred in Diakonidis' home. He lived at the house with his wife and two children. They fled the home in fear. Diakonidis grabbed his rifle, which I believe was an M1 carbine, and then just began walking in the street and shooting at anything. 2 people were shot dead, but multiple other people narrowly missed gunfire in their cars. Multiple cars were shot. At approximately 9 a.m. that morning, the Victorian police, who had pinned Diakonidis down in the area of his home, shot Diakonidis dead when he came out of his hiding spot brandishing his rifle. So they are the basic details of the Tyrrell Crescent shootings of 1994. Let's now go and see where it actually happened in Fawkner, Melbourne. Tyrrell Crescent, Fawkner, Melbourne. On the corner with Lynch Road, down this anonymous street in Fawkner, Melbourne, is Tyrrell Crescent. Scene of the December 5th, 1994 shootings. Monday morning, December 5th, 1994. It was a stinking hot day in Melbourne, as it was in Adelaide, I remember well. It was in the high 30s, and this is the scene of Tyrrell Crescent in Fawkner, suburb of North Melbourne. In this home here lived 49-year-old Photius Diakonidis. At approximately 7:15 a.m. that hot morning, Diakonidis snapped. The exact circumstances leading up to his shootings are a bit hazy. He lived at home with his wife and I believe 2 children, teenage children. Whether there was an argument or anything that precipitated what happened next, I'm not sure. But the wife and the 2 children fled the home here, fearing for their lives. Diakonidis must have threatened them with his rifle to kill them. When they left, he indeed did grab at least 1 rifle and walked out into the street here in Tyrrell Crescent and began randomly shooting at anything. Cars, pedestrians, and it is a miracle that only 2 people were killed. Though small comfort for those 2 victims. So I believe Diakonidis left the home here, number 38 Tyrrell Crescent, and began stalking the street here in Tyrrell Crescent and randomly shooting. Made his way along Tyrrell Crescent when he came to the corner of Vervale Avenue, Tyrrell Crescent. Now this home here on the corner of Tyrrell and Vervale was where Diakonidis struck for the first time. Number 42 Vervale Avenue. A woman named Donna Ciccudi and her husband and 2 small children came out to investigate the shooting. Diakonidis spotted them and began pursuing them. They ran back into the home, but Diakonidis fired a shot through one of these windows which struck Donna Ciccudi and fatally wounded her. after shooting dead his first victim in this house here, a car moving along Vervale Avenue in this direction must have come through here and then into Tyrrell Crescent. Diakonidis must have been somewhere in this vicinity. And as the car made the turn from Vervale onto Tyrrell, most likely when it was on Tyrrell, Diakonidis fired a shot into the car, striking a man in his mid-20s, whose name unfortunately I cannot find. But I remember he was a man in his mid-20s, and he was shot in the back of the head as he headed toward Lynch Road, and his car actually continued some distance along Tyrrell Crescent here until it smashed into a stovey pole. I'm assuming the man was already dead before he hit the stovey pole. I'm pretty sure it was this stovey pole here that the man's, I think it was a red Commodore, crashed into right around here on Tyrrell Crescent, just short of the intersection of Tyrrell and Lynch Road. Diakonidis, I think, didn't venture further than the kind of intersection with Warwick Street, Vervale Avenue and Tyrrell Crescent. He fired at numerous cars, he hit numerous cars. As I said, amazingly, other than his two victims, there was no one else shot. There was a third man who suffered superficial wounds to his shoulder. A motorist, who was struck by a bullet smashed into his windshield, and I believe he had some superficial cuts from glass. But other than that, and the two victims, no one else was actually wounded by gunfire, which just seems incredible. As I said, Diakonidis was shooting randomly at anything. People, cars, and as you can see, it's a sleepy suburban area, but there's a fair bit of traffic around, and eventually the police, of course, arrived en masse, and Diakonidis was pinned down in this vicinity here, the vicinity of his driveway, where a somewhat standoff ensued. At approximately 9 a.m, less than 2 hours after the shootings began, I believe a woman coming off Warwick Street, which is that street just up there, drove through the police cordon. Don't ask me how, but apparently that's what happened. And I think she drove into Tyrrell Crescent. Diakonidis taking his chance, presented himself. Yes, Diakonidis came out of whatever position he was in and attempted to fire at this woman. The police special operations group responded, yelling for him to drop the rifle. He was armed with an M1 carbine semi-automatic. He must have pointed his rifle at the SOG, and they opened fire, and Fotios Diakonidis was shot dead in this general vicinity of his front yard, either in the driveway or around the neighbour's driveway in the front. Somewhere in this vicinity, Diakonidis was shot dead, ending the Tyrrell Crescent shootings, which claimed 2 lives, 3 including Diakonidis, before it ended. So that was the Tyrrell Crescent shootings of December the 5th, 1994, in this street here, in this quiet little suburb of Fawkner, Melbourne, in what has largely been forgotten, the Tyrrell Crescent shootings. I remember at the time one of the police officers, he described it as a hoddle street on a smaller scale, and it certainly was. It was a random shooting, and the death toll could have been much higher, but for luck and circumstance it wasn't. Tyrrell Crescent faces the Charles Mutton Reserve. One of my abiding memories of that shootings, as I said, it happened in December 1994 when I was 17 years old, and the police had cordoned off this area, and the TV camera was positioned somewhere behind these buildings here in the Charles Mutton Reserve. The cameraman from the TV news was positioned with police cowering, and you could hear Diakonidis in the distance yelling out, "Come and get me." And it was truly, I remember, it was haunting to hear that. And then you heard gunfire erupt, and obviously Diakonidis shot dead right here on Tyrrell Crescent, Melbourne.